Well, we'll go ahead and get started. It's nice to have everyone here. Just a reminder that this is going to be recorded. So if you do type into the chat or if you'd like to say recorded, but really happy to have you guys all here. And if there is anything you miss or you need to jump off, you will have this video upload later during the week. So first, I want to get started by introducing Matt Rudge. You probably have maybe seen his name or face around Co-Institute. Whether you're on the first project or the last project, you probably might have heard of him there. But if you don't mind introducing yourself, then
yeah, I'll just say the same as I say at the beginning of the videos. Hi, my name is Matt. I'm senior product developer here with Code Institute. So yeah, look, I'm approaching my 7th year now, the end of my 7th year with Code Institute. I joined when the company was really, really small. We were in a tiny office. There was about 10 of us. And sort of since then, I've taught the course in classrooms, both here in Ireland and also over in the Netherlands. And then since 2018, been in-house developing the content and, trying to see ways we can teach this stuff better. So we've got lots of exciting stuff in the pipeline, but that's not what I'm here to talk to you about today. So yeah, it's mostly about validation today, if you don't mind me jumping straight into it there, Sawyer. Is that all right?
Absolutely. Go ahead.
Okay, brilliant. Yeah, so validation. Why? So you're probably thinking to yourself, of all the things that we could talk about on a community call, why are we talking about code validation? And there's two main reasons behind it. One is that it's one thing that we sometimes overlook just before we submit our project. And the second thing is that particularly when it comes to PP4, there can be some confusion about how to validate your code because we don't really explicitly tell you. And as a result, sometimes it can come back that your code has not passed validation and you can be confused and wondering why. So the purpose of the call today, I suppose, or what I wanted to talk about is ways that we can avoid those gotchas so that, you put a lot of work into your projects. I see projects that come through. I get privileged to be able to look at some of them, and it's the work that you guys do is absolutely amazing. So I would hate for you to end up with a fail based on something small like code validation. So that's what I asked Sawyer if I could speak to you about today, and he kindly said I could.
Kindly let him. No,
yeah.
It's going to be fantastic. Doing the course ourselves, myself as well. Code validation is something that you definitely need to keep in mind once you're there. So we'll go ahead and get into it then. I want to ask you, Matt, then, what tips, particularly in HTML validation? I know vary depending on which project you're on, but let's say you're starting your first PP1 project or your first milestone project. What advice would you give for HTML validation?
Key thing is validate early. It's much easier to find a problem when it's first happened than to wait and to be trying to fix all of them at the end. So the one that we always recommend to you, it's in the program material, I'll just paste it into the chat here as well, is to use a W3 validator. That's the one that we also use internally when we're checking. So that's good, for you guys to know that. With your first project, what you could probably just do is, you'll see when you go to the validator, there's 3 tabs: validate by URI, validate by file upload, or validate by direct input. So the easiest thing to do actually is just to copy your HTML page, paste it into the direct input tab, correct the mistakes in there, and then paste it back into your editor. That's a really nice, easy way of doing it. So, and this is sort of a good recommendation for PP1 and PP2, or milestone 1 and milestone 2, is to just copy your HTML, paste it in, fix the mistakes there so it comes up with no more errors, and then paste it back into your editor. That's the tip for HTML validation, but do use the W3 validator, definitely.
And would there be a big difference between, obviously you wouldn't want to keep any errors, but would there be a difference in keeping perhaps warnings?
Warnings are okay. If it comes up an error, then you definitely want to fix that, but you won't fail on an error, on a warning, sorry. You'll fail on an error, but not on a warning. And usually what happens as well, we'll get into this a little bit later with the Django, the PP4 or milestone 4 stuff. Usually what happens is because we tend to use the same template across our projects. Like if you're doing your first project, you might have your home page, and then what you do is you say, oh, I'm going to just copy that home page. I'm going to paste it into an about page. So usually what happens is that the same errors end up transferring because we're copying and pasting. So that's where validating early comes in. And it's also where, checking to make sure that those errors aren't propagating comes in. But yeah, you can safely ignore warnings, or definitely fix the errors.
Good advice there. And good, thanks for putting in that link there as well. There's the little logo there for the W3C validator there, in case you're watching this on a recording, that you could just type that in for the HTML validation there. Very good. So we'll move on a little bit more complex code now for CSS validation. Is it kind of the same idea, or what tips or advice would we need to watch out for that?
Yeah, it's pretty much the same. I'm going to put the link in again to the W3 Jigsaw CSS validator. This, again, it's the one that we use internally when we're checking your CSS. You've got two ways of doing it. Again, I just suggest that for your first and second milestone projects, just do it by direct input. Copy your entire CSS file, paste it into the direct input box, and fix whatever warning errors you have in there. What are common errors that we encounter when it comes to CSS validation? Duplicated IDs. Don't forget that an ID has to be unique. So there's two ways that you can do this. You can either have an ID in your CSS which has the same name, so two IDs with the same name. Of course, if you try to do that in your HTML as well, you'll get an error there. So it kind of, transfers between those two. But again, just direct input is usually the best. Paste it in, fix the errors, copy it, and paste it back. In the CSS validator, you've got quite a lot of options that you can use as well, but what you're taught on the program here and what you're going to be using is usually CSS level 3. So leave it at that. You can pretty much leave everything as normal, unless you're doing something a little bit weird, in which case you can, change reporting for vendor extensions and things like that. But generally, we leave everything the same at default. We don't change it from the default when we're checking your CSS. So pretty similar with the HTML. For your first and second projects, just copy, paste it into direct input, fix it, paste it back. That's usually the best option.
Very good. Good advice there as well. And if anyone does have any questions in the meantime, we'll have a question and answer at the end, but you can also put your question into the chat box and we can come around to it when we get a chance.
Yep, 100%.
So HTML and CSS, quite similar for validation, is that correct?
Yes, very similar. We use the same kind of, it's all on the W3 website, so it's, it works in a very, very similar way.
Very good. So I guess we'll go for a little bit of a curveball now then. What tips or advice would you give when it comes to JavaScript, particularly maybe when someone's working on their second project, whether it's Milestone 2 or PP2, Project Portfolio 2?
JavaScript validation. Now, isn't that a bit of fun? Oh, JavaScript, we love you. JS Hint is definitely the site to use. Now, JS Hint's kind of interesting in that JS Hint doesn't actually throw errors. Everything it throws are warnings, which means that some of the JS Hint stuff you can safely ignore. For instance, if you're that's a good question, Douglas. I'll come back to that one. So with JS hint, again, it's copying and pasting your JavaScript in there. But if you're using something like the Bootstrap JavaScript, or you're using jQuery, then JS hint might not actually be able to understand what's going on. And it'll say that you've got undefined variables and things like that. So what you can actually do is, in JS hint, there's a little link at the top which says configure, and you can configure it there as to exactly what you want. So if you're using jQuery, you can click on configure and you can say switch on jQuery, and then it will no longer bug you about unused variables and things like that. Usually you can just keep it as is. With the new JavaScript features switched on, ES6, that's what we recommend that you use. But again, it's copying your code, pasting it into jshint.com, and just fixing whatever seems to be glaring. Now, if there's an error there that you're not sure about, you're like, why is it saying this? This makes no sense to me. You can just type that into Google, put it on Slack, something like that. Hey, has anyone else seen this? Is it a big problem? Do I need to fix it, or can I leave it? JS hint, the name, the clue is in the name. It's very unopinionated. JS hint. It gives you hints. It came from a project called JS Lint, which is really, really opinionated and very, very strict. And we don't use that. It's way too strict. So use JS hint. If you're getting some warnings, click on the configure button at the top and see if you can configure those out, because they probably are okay in your project. And if there's any left that you can't fix, then Slack or just search for it on the internet and you'll come up with some kind of a solution.
Very good.
Can we say something else about JavaScript? Sorry, before we move on.
Yeah, go on.
Semicolons. We hate them. They're horrible. We forget them all the time at the end of our code. But JS hint will actually, complain if you're not using semicolons. JavaScript does this thing called automatic semicolon insertion. So it's very kind to you in some ways. If you don't put a semicolon on, JavaScript will throw it in there for you or pretend that it's there, but it can cause problems in certain instances if you don't, because automatic semicolon insertion is only so clever. So just try to remember, stick your semicolons on the end of your lines, and that's a big gotcha.
Very good. And I think Douglas had a good question there as well. Obviously, when it comes to HTML and CSS, you don't want to have any warnings or any errors. Sorry, the warnings. Take a look into it. But mostly fine. But what about with JS hint that you're saying it only gives errors? How many errors would you say you're allowed on a project if they miss something by accident, perhaps?
There isn't really a threshold, Douglas. That's the thing. So let's say, for instance, that you submit your project and everything is good, it works perfectly, and you've got one error in your HTML on one page. You're not going to fail on that because the rest of your work kind of, goes, we won't argue with that. We'll let that one go because it's clearly something that was missed. If you've got an error that's duplicated across multiple pages, even if it's the same error, then that would be a fail, because we would expect that to have been picked up. When it comes to things like JavaScript, sometimes you may choose just to ignore the warnings that are in JS hint. If you do, what I would just say is put it in your README file. So say, I validated with JS hint, it gave these warnings. I decided to leave them because of this reason, it wasn't affecting my code, and it was probably an issue with JS hint or whatever it is. As long as you're upfront about these things, usually there's no problem, so that's the thing. If you'll see as well when we come on to PEP 8 in Python, that there are times where it's perfectly okay to ignore the validator. But when you do, just put it in your README. That's the thing.
really helps flesh out the README too, doesn't it?
It does. It does. Yep. You know, I say this to every student: view the README like your confessional. You know, you can just come in there and spill your guts and tell us everything, because there's almost nothing that's out of bounds with that.
Very good. Very good. Is there anything you wanted to say lastly on JavaScript before we move on to our next one?
No, I think that's good. I
Cool.
think that's good.
So we'll move on to another one. Maybe if you're on project 3, go back there actually, didn't want to skip. What tips or advice would you give particularly for Python? And we'll get to you just in one moment there, Douglas.
Okay, so for Python. So for Python, use the pep8 linter that we've created, because you can't go wrong with that. There you go. Again, it's copy and pasted in. It's an editor, so you can actually correct the errors there and then paste it back through. Now, there are times I would actually recommend people to read the pep8 specification. I'm just going to see if I can pop that online there. Yeah, pep8, there we go. Just have I would recommend that you actually read this. Because one of the things that Guido said when he wrote pep8 was that there are times where it's perfectly okay to break pep8. His guidance is, when applying these guidelines would make the code less readable, then feel free to ignore it. If you've got surrounding code that also breaks it, possibly for historic reasons, you know, you can break it. If it needs to remain compatible, or, you know, there's several reasons why it's okay to break pep8. But if you do, talk about it in your README file. That's the thing. In general, the biggest fail areas that we see with pep8 are lines too long. So have a look about how to break up lines so that you don't end up with lines that are too long. And just on this as well, the difference, if you're using Django, lots of Django's own files, such as settings.py and even often the URLs files, they break pep8. In fact, if you search for Django pep8, you'll find that there's a big discussion about it that was actually started by a long-time Code Institute employee who moved on to pastures new recently, Yoni Lavi. So Yoni actually started a query with the Django project of what's the story here? You know, why is it breaking pep8? And this is how we could fix it. And they basically went, nah, we're not doing that. So you don't have to make Django's own files like settings.py, you know, manage.py, those, you don't have to make those pep8 compliant, but code that you write does have to be. Unless you've created, unless you've creatively broken it, in which case put it in your README file.
Very good. It's always good, like you said, the confessional there. And there's a question there from Lucia saying, can we use hashtag #NoQA for the lines that are over 80 characters, which we do not want to break apart for better readability? So what would you recommend there?
Yes, you certainly can. But again, put it in your README file. That's what you've done. Douglas, sorry, did you have a question there?
Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to find out, would you ever advise using things like Prettier and all that for JavaScript, as it does automatically add the semicolons at the end? And then the other one is, now I know with pep8, I think you must keep it to 80 lines of code. Should you also recommend something similar to that in JavaScript?
JavaScript, there's no limit to the length that you can have. But one thing that I think is always good, so why was pep8 written? It was written to give a bit of a style guide for code. The key aim being readability. It's a fact about code that it's read more often by humans than it is by machines. And so it's important that humans can read code. Okay, so although I wouldn't necessarily say that you should stick to the 80 characters per line thing with JavaScript, when you're coding, if you can have an eye on readability, that's why Python has white space rather than curly braces, because it forces you to make the code a bit more readable by indenting it. JavaScript, in actual fact, because of the semicolon line terminator, you could have the whole thing on one line if you wanted. But I would always have an eye on readability with your code. So yeah, you don't have to stick to PEP 8 with JavaScript, but do think about making it readable. And in answer to your question about using extensions such as Prettier or things like that, go for it, 100%. Programming is an exercise in laziness. We write code because we want things to happen quicker, and because we can't be bothered doing it manually ourselves. So any tools that we have that speed up that process, that's definitely thinking like a coder.
I think this is a similar to what you just answered actually there, but somebody was asking they throw their code into some AI, asking if there's any errors or suggestions to produce CSS, and that Prettier also helps with their formatting, like missing colons. And would you have any advice regarding for it or against it?
Yeah, cool. That's a good question. So absolutely, put your code in ChatGPT, but I'll just give you just a little warning about that. Make sure that whatever it gives you back, you know what it does, because ChatGPT is still prone to hallucination. And sometimes the code that it's given me back on stuff just does not work at all. So just make sure that whatever comes back, you know what it's doing and that you know that it works. And as regards Prettier, any HTML linters, any CSS stuff like that are, for JavaScript. There's also, I think with our template, we have a PEP 8 extension that's included as well. So yeah, any tools like that, definitely do use them, because they'll keep your code looking neat and readable. And even for JavaScript that doesn't require indentation, you'll get automatic indentation with it as well. If it's all right, just for a couple of minutes. Oh no, sorry. It's the next slide. Sorry, I'm just gonna shut up. Yeah.
We're just about to move on to one of the biggest, I think, possible headaches for students whenever they get through their PP4. I believe is that the kind of train of thought you were getting on?
That's exactly where I was. Yes.
Right. So we'll move on to that one then. So particularly when you're working with the Django, you've said that some mentioned before that students can have a bit of a headache when trying to do validation for their HTML with Django or their Python, etc. So can you say a little bit more about that and what maybe people need to look out for on PP4 for validation, or particularly working with Django at all?
Yeah, 100%. Thank you. So I think what we often try to do with Django is that we take our template code, we'll copy and paste our base.html and put it into the direct input box because we don't know what else to do. And it'll give us lots of warnings because there's Django template tags in there and we don't know what, and so we kind of tend to look at it and go, oh, well, it's probably okay then. Validating Django is a different kind of a beast to looking at our earlier projects, like we said. So what I would do with Django is run the server on your in Code Anywhere or Gitpod or VS Code or whatever it is you're doing, and then paste the address of your page, of your site, into the URI box on the W3 validator. The reason why I'm saying this is because then you're getting the rendered HTML. You're actually getting what the browser is going to see, as opposed to the code to generate the HTML, which is what you'd get if you just copy and paste directly from your template files. Why is that important? Because The most common, by far, the most common error that we've seen in HTML with Django projects is that there's an error in base.html, which is then replicated across every single page in your project, because everything is inheriting from the base HTML template. If you validate by URI, either a deployed version of your project before you submit, or running the server, in your development environment and putting the address in there, then you'll be able to see whether the HTML validates or not. CSS validation, you can do exactly the same way as we talked about for projects 1 and 2. You can take your CSS file, copy it, paste it into Jigsaw. You can validate your...
Here's what I found.
Oh, Siri seems to think it's found something to help us as well. With JavaScript, you can copy and paste it into JS hint, and with PEP8 stuff, you can copy and paste it into our Python linter as well. But for HTML, that's the biggest area that we see, is that there's an error in base HTML and it replicates across every single page, and that's the problem. Letting you into a little secret as well, we don't check, we don't validate pages that are behind authentication. So your profile page and things like that, our system presently doesn't validate those. It only validates the public facing pages. So as long as you've made sure that they're all okay, then you should be pretty much okay with your HTML validation in Django. But please do not copy and paste your template code into the validator, because it'll just cause errors for you, and you won't, and they'll maybe mask things that are actually genuinely problems.
Some really good advice. And for those who maybe aren't quite on the PP4 yard just understanding Django, it's going to be good to remember this, and we can go back to this once you get to that in your projects, because I think you've mentioned that is one of the things that I know, at least when I was working on my my project where I needed to use the Django, I was just copying the template HTML language and putting it in there. I was like, oh yeah, I guess it's fine.
Yeah, that's often the thing. It's not Amy, can you use view page source? Yes, you can do that as well.
Yeah, and the question there, I'll just repeat it out there, like, can we use viewed page source method via deployed site for each HTML page validation?
Yep, you can do that as well if you wish. I personally find it a little bit slower than just copying and pasting the URLs and putting it in, but you can absolutely do that as well if you wish. Just make sure you do validate. That's the thing. It's, as we said at the beginning, it's a horrible thing after you've put so much work into to end up failing on validation.
Absolutely.
Just one last thing when it comes to Python as well, because actually, if you wouldn't mind, Sawyer, may I just share my screen there for a moment?
Yeah, of course.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm just going to share. I'll share my whole screen here. Right. So this is PEP8 CI, the Python linter that we've done. One thing that you can do, I'm going to just go to one of my public repos here. Let's take this one. So when you go into a Python file, you can click on View Raw, which gives you the whole. Well, you can do this on any file actually, but if you do this, View Raw, then one of the things that our linter allows you to do is to copy that address and just stick it on the end there, and then it'll load it in automatically for you. So, if that's helpful to you, it's just, it has a little API there that will actually load the file. So just but you have to get the raw one. That's the only thing. So it has to begin with raw. So just copy that, and then you can just stick it on the end of pep8ci. And we did that because we wanted to be able to API it out ourselves. A sneak preview of what is, well, the part needs to be active before you paste it in. No, it doesn't need to be. So just a little thing that what we are wanting to do, and this has been in development for a number of years, but because of other things it's got parked, is that we want to actually have a thing where you can put in the GitHub URL and the live URL of your project, and then it will actually go through and it will do all the validation for you and tell you where the errors are in your HTML, your CSS, your JavaScript, your Python, and it will also tell you if you've got any broken links on your page as well. And then when you click on it, it will actually bring you to this, open it up in the Python linter so you can see where the errors are. So that's one thing that we're working on and we're hoping to get back to. But yeah, just a little hint there for using our Python linter.
Really good, some good advice there. So thanks for that, Matt.
You're welcome.
I guess we'll leave it to Q&As. We've asked a few questions already, but if anyone has any extra questions for Matt regarding validation, or is there anything else you'd like to mention there, Matt, regarding validation? Any more tips or advice?
Just to validate early. If you take one thing away, if you take two things away from this call, one is validate early, and two is validate by URI for your Django projects, or as Amy said, view the page source and then copy and paste it in. But if those are the two things you take away from the call today, then I'd be happy. Do we have to take pictures of all validated pages even if we have no errors? No, not unless you want to. Sometimes it's nice to be able to see that there's no errors showing, but there shouldn't be a time where your code changes so that it once validated and then now doesn't. So that's up to you, but you don't have to.
Very good. Well, I want to give you a big thank you, Matt. Give you a little. There we go. I never know which emoji is better, but thank you for this validation criteria. I think it's going to be very helpful for people, especially regarding their Django projects and Python. I know for myself that was quite a bit of a headache. So thanks for your help.
No problem at all. You're very welcome. Nice to see you all. All the best with your projects. All the best with the rest of the course.
Yeah.
And hopefully sometime in the future we'll be, I think you're going to be getting some other program people here in these community calls as well. So you'll get a chance to meet a few more of us.
Yeah. Well, thanks again. And we'll see you guys around. And thanks for joining the call as well. Take care.
Nice to meet you all. Thanks for organizing it, sir.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.